The hall was built to make people feel small. That was the truth of it, even if nobody who designed it would ever say so out loud. The ceiling climbed so high that the top of it disappeared into a pale blue glow. The walls curved like the inside of a giant bowl, and along those curved walls sat hundreds of alien delegates in rising rows of seats, all looking down at the white floor below. The floor was flat and round, and polished so clean that it reflected the lights above like still water. In the center of that floor sat a wide circular table, and around that table sat the representatives of every major civilization in the known galaxy. It was called the Galactic Conclave. It had existed for over 400 years. In that time, it had ended wars, redrawn borders, created trade agreements that spanned dozens of star systems, and settled disputes that might otherwise have killed millions. It was, by most accounts, the single most powerful governing body in the galaxy. Humanity had held a seat at that table for 300 years. In all that time, they had never been treated as equals. Junho walked into the hall at exactly the scheduled time. He was not a man who drew attention when he entered a room. He was average in height, with short dark hair that had gone gray at the sides, and a face that was calm in the way a deep lake is calm, still on the surface, with a great deal happening underneath. He wore the dark blue coat of Earth's diplomatic corps, pressed flat and buttoned all the way up. His shoes were clean. His posture was straight. He looked like a man who had slept well and eaten a good breakfast, and had nothing in particular to worry about. None of that was entirely true, but he had spent 30 years learning how to look like it was. Behind him walked Nara. She was his aide, and she had been working with him for 6 years. She was younger than him by about 2 decades, with sharp eyes and a way of moving that suggested she was always slightly ahead of the conversation. She was carrying a flat document case under one arm, holding it the way someone holds something they are not planning to put down. They took their seats at the table. The session had been going for nearly 2 hours already. It had started without them, which was not unusual. Humanity's seat was often treated as optional, present when convenient, ignored when not. The current speaker was Counselor Dreth Vaz of the Velthari Empire. He was tall even by Velthari standards, with long pale fingers and silver threading woven through his ceremonial robes. He had a voice that was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a person who had never once been told to sit down and wait their turn. He was speaking about the trade proposal. The Sorhai Dominion had introduced a motion 6 weeks ago. On paper, it was a restructuring of Earth's trade classification under conclave law. In practice, it was a transfer of power. The motion proposed reducing humanity's independent trade rights by 60%, requiring Earth to route the majority of its exports through Sorhai-approved channels. The official justification cited a scoring system called the Cultural and Developmental Index, which measured civilizations against a set of standards that, coincidentally, had been written largely by Sorhai academics. Humanity's score fell just below the threshold for full trade autonomy. It had fallen below that threshold every time the Conclave had reviewed it for the past 40 years. Dreth Vaz was not Sorhai, but he was speaking in support of the motion. His support was not surprising. The Velthari and the Sorhai had been political allies for a long time, and both of them had long viewed humanity as something between a useful resource and a minor inconvenience. He finished his remarks, straightened his robes, and sat back down. Several delegates made sounds of agreement. Vas Kathara, the lead Sorhai minister, a broad-shouldered figure with a flat, wide face and small, careful eyes, nodded slowly across the table. The session moderator, a six-limbed creature from one of the neutral worlds, looked toward Junho. Ambassador Junho of Earth, it said, you may respond to the motion. Junho did not stand right away. He sat for a moment with both hands resting flat on the table. He looked at Nara. She opened the document case and took out the thing inside it. A short bound document, perhaps 5 or 6 pages, with a plain cover. She slid it across the table to him, without a word. He picked it up. He stood. "Thank you," he said. His voice carried easily across the hall, without effort. "I will not be responding to the motion today." A small ripple of noise moved through the seats above. "Instead," he said, "I would like to read a statement on behalf of the government of Earth and all 14 of our colony worlds." He looked down at the document and began to read. The statement was not what anyone expected. There was no anger in it, no raised voice, no dramatic language. It was written the way a record is written, clear, factual, and precise. It began with a single sentence that said Earth was withdrawing from the Galactic Conclave, effective immediately, and severing all formal diplomatic ties with its member states. Then it listed reasons. Not complaints, not feelings, reasons, documented and sourced. It listed every military conflict humanity had committed soldiers to on behalf of the Conclave in the past century. 31 separate engagements, with dates and casualty numbers. It listed every piece of medical technology Earth had shared freely, without licensing fees, with species that had no equivalent. It listed the agricultural support missions, the infrastructure repair projects, the famine relief shipments, the search and rescue operations. It listed the 3 major peace agreements that human mediators had brokered between civilizations that could not stand each other long enough to negotiate. It listed the Velthari navigation software deal, the one signed 60 years ago in which Earth had licensed its deep space routing technology for a fraction of its value, because the Velthari negotiators had pushed hard, and Earth had, at the time, been too eager to be helpful to push back. It listed the Sorhai hull plating contracts, the Orvesi water purification systems, the Hasari medical database sharing agreement. It was a long list. By the time Junho reached the 3rd page, the hall had gone completely silent. Not the polite silence of a chamber waiting for a speaker to finish. A different kind of silence. The kind that falls when something unexpected has happened and nobody yet knows what to do about it. He read to the end. The last paragraph said that Earth did not leave in anger. It said that humanity had served the Conclave in good faith for 300 years and had received contempt in return, and that this was no longer acceptable. It said that Earth's door was not closed, that any state wishing to engage with humanity was welcome to make contact through open channels, which would be monitored and answered at Earth's discretion. The final line was short. "We came to this table in good faith. We are leaving it the same way." Junho set the document down on the table. He reached up and buttoned the top button of his coat, which had worked slightly loose while he was reading. Then he looked up at the room, at Dreth Vaz, whose long face had gone very still, at Voskathara, who was leaning forward now, both hands gripping the edge of the table, at the rows and rows of delegates above, all of them staring down at him with expressions that ranged from shock to confusion to the early stages of something that had not yet decided whether it was anger or fear. He nodded once, a small, quiet nod, the kind you give to someone you are parting from without hard feelings. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Nara was already moving beside him. Neither of them spoke. Behind them, the hall came apart. Voices broke out from every direction. Someone was shouting for order. Dreth Vaz was on his feet. The session moderator was calling out in 3 languages at once. Someone from the Sorhai delegation was demanding that the severance notice be declared procedurally invalid. The doors ahead of Junho opened as he approached. He and Nara walked through. The doors slid closed behind them. The corridor outside was long and quiet and completely empty. Nara spoke first. "They'll call it a bluff," she said. Her voice was steady. "I know," said Junho. "It isn't one." "No," he said, "it isn't." Their footsteps echoed down the corridor as they walked toward the docking bay where their ship was waiting to take them home. The embassies went dark one by one, and nobody made a ceremony of it. On 16 worlds across the galaxy, human diplomatic staff packed their personal items into standard travel cases, handed over building access codes to local administrative contacts, and boarded departure shuttles without fanfare. They were polite and professional about every part of it. Some of the local contacts tried to ask questions. The staff smiled and said they had no comment to offer, and then they left. The embassy lights went off, the flags came down, the buildings sat empty behind locked doors. It took 11 days for all of it to be done. On Earth, the change was not visible from the street. The morning transport systems ran on their usual schedules. Markets opened at the usual times. Construction on the new transit lines outside the capital continued without interruption. Schools were in session. The weather was unremarkable. If the person had walked through any of Earth's major cities in the days after the severance and not known what had just happened, they would have noticed nothing unusual at all. That was not an accident. Suji had been tracking the numbers for almost 2 months before the severance was announced. She worked in a low 2-story building in the Eastern Administrative District, in an office that had too many screens and not enough natural light. With a cabinet full of data drives and a habit of staying 2 or 3 hours past the end of her official shift. She was 29 years old and had been building economic models of interstellar dependency for 4 years. And for most of that time, her work had been treated as the kind of useful but not urgent research that gets read by a small number of thoughtful people and then filed away. That had changed. She had started the dependency map because she was good at noticing patterns in data, and the patterns she had been seeing for months all pointed in the same direction. She had not known exactly what was coming, but she had started building the map anyway, pulling data from trade records, supply chain filings, infrastructure maintenance contracts, and 100 smaller documents that most people did not think were worth reading. She let the shape of them emerge. The shape was more than she had expected. The map was displayed on an entire wall of her office, a web of colored lines linking stars and worlds and trade routes, with human contributions marked in white. When she finished the first full version and stepped back and looked at it, she did not say anything for almost 2 full minutes. She just stood there. White lines were everywhere. 3 alien border systems were receiving regular agricultural support from Earth in the form of food supplements and soil treatment compounds. These shipments had been going out for decades, quietly and without publicity, because the systems in question had depleted their agricultural soil through heavy industrial use and had never fully recovered. The Conclave's official records listed these systems as self-sufficient. Their governments had allowed the human support to continue because it was easier than admitting the problem, and Earth had continued sending it because that was what Earth did. Those shipments had now stopped. The Veltari Empire, which had been among the loudest voices calling humanity a minor and dependent civilization, had licensed human-developed navigation software for its deep space fleet 60 years ago. The license had been cheap because the Veltari had negotiated hard at the time, and Earth had agreed without understanding the long-term value of what they were giving away. The software had been updated and maintained by a small human engineering firm ever since, under a service contract that was technically still under active review. The review had been formally opened. The soar-high numbers were the ones Suji kept returning to. 43% of the active hull plating on soar-high military vessels had been manufactured in human foundries. The soar-high procurement records listed 3 alternative suppliers as backup options. One of those suppliers had not fulfilled a major contract in 14 months due to internal production failures. The other 2 were slower and significantly more expensive. The Soar-High Military Procurement Office was aware of all of this. They had simply not prioritized finding a solution because the human supply had been completely reliable for over a decade. The foundry contracts had been cancelled with 30 days' notice, as the contract terms required. Suji compiled the map into a formal report and sent it up through proper channels. 2 days later, she was called into a meeting with people who had much more senior titles than she did. They looked at the map in silence for a long time. One of them asked if she was confident in the numbers. She said yes. Another asked whether there could be modeling errors. She said she had run the methodology 6 times and offered to walk through it in detail. Nobody asked her to. A third person asked how long it would take for the effects to become visible. She told them it depended on the system, but that several of them would start showing signs within 4 to 6 weeks. The map was classified by the end of the day. It was leaked 48 hours after that. Suji did not know who had done it. She had a reasonable idea, but she did not pursue the question. When the data appeared on independent galactic news networks, it spread within hours. Journalists and analysts who had been framing the severance as an Earth political crisis found themselves looking at numbers that told a completely different story. Admiral Tejo had already seen the map by then. He had read it once, set it down, walked the perimeter of the base twice, and then come back and read it again. He was not a man who showed surprise easily, but the map had done something close to that. He had sat with the numbers for a long time before he started coordinating the military withdrawal. The withdrawal of Earth's joint patrol fleets from 12 galactic transit corridors was done cleanly, in order, with full advance notice given to every station along each corridor. Tejo made sure the documentation was complete. Every handover was logged. Every Allied contact was given adequate time to prepare. He was not trying to cause disorder. He was following orders, and his orders said to pull back. The disorder happened anyway. Within a month, conflict had broken out in 3 of the 12 corridors. 2 long-standing faction disputes that had been kept cold by the presence of human patrol ships had finally gone hot. A 3rd corridor saw a sharp increase in unregistered traffic, fast-moving vessels with no transponders, the kind that carried things that did not appear in any official manifest. The Conclave sent communications to Earth. The messages were carefully worded. None of them used the word help. They spoke of coordination opportunities and shared strategic interests. They spoke of the importance of galactic stability as a collective value. They expressed the hope that Earth would consider resuming a role in certain areas of mutual concern. Not one of them contained an apology. Suji read the transcripts late at night in her office, with a cold cup of tea she had forgotten about, sitting beside her keyboard. She read them carefully, all of them, and made notes. Then she updated the dependency map with new projections for corridor deterioration, and flagged 3 additional systems that were beginning to show supply stress. She sent the updated file to Tejo and to Junho, who was back on Earth by then, working from a quiet office near the southern coast. Junho read the update. He looked at the map for a while. Then he made himself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the sea. He did not reply to the Conclave's messages. On the galactic news networks, the early narrative about humanity having an internal crisis was fading. The new coverage was about food supply concerns on the border systems, about procurement delays in Sorhai military shipbuilding, about instability in the transit corridors. None of the major outlets connected these stories to each other out loud, but the connections were visible to anyone who looked, and more people were looking. The dependency map, once classified, was now being discussed in academic papers, political commentary, and late-night broadcasts on a dozen worlds. Analysts who had never thought much about Earth were suddenly reading everything they could find about what humanity had actually been doing for the past 3 centuries. What they found surprised them. It surprised some of them, enough to keep them awake at night. The first ship showed up without warning on a Tuesday morning, and Minho almost missed it. He was halfway through a cup of coffee and reading through a routine maintenance log when the sensor alert came in. He set the coffee down and looked at his screen. The incoming vessel was holding position about 90,000 kilometers out, well within passive sensor range of Yonsei 7, but far enough back to stay technically outside Earth's designated approach boundary. Its registration codes came through clean. Velthari diplomatic transport, mid-class, single vessel, no listed escort. It had not transmitted an entry request in advance. No prior contact, no scheduled arrival. It had simply appeared and stopped. Minho flagged the reading for Lieutenant Commander Bora, who came over and looked at the screen with her arms crossed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send the standard reply." The standard reply had been drafted by Earth's Foreign Affairs Office shortly after the severance was finalized. It was brief and professional. It said that Earth's diplomatic channels were not currently active, that the vessel was welcome to remain in neutral space, and that it should have a safe onward journey. It did not ask what the ship wanted. It did not offer to connect them with anyone. It did not invite them closer. Mingho sent it. Then he went back to his coffee. The Velthari ship did not leave. It responded within 20 minutes, requesting a live communication link with an Earth diplomatic representative. The message was formal, and used a lot of careful language about the importance of open dialogue in times of uncertainty. Mingho logged the request, sent back a short acknowledgement confirming receipt, and took no further action. That was exactly what his standing orders said to do. He went home at the end of his shift. When he came back the next morning, the Velthari ship was still there. It had sent 2 more messages overnight, both of them variations of the same request, both of them receiving the same logged acknowledgement and nothing else. On the 3rd day, a second Velthari vessel arrived, smaller, possibly a courier, and parked itself nearby. By the 4th day, a 3rd message had come in. The tone in this one was slightly different, less formal, slightly more urgent around the edges. Minho noted the shift in his log. On the morning of the 5th day, both ships turned around and left without a final transmission. Minho watched them disappear from the sensor screen. He did not feel the way he might have expected to feel. There was no thrill in it, no satisfaction exactly. It was more like the feeling of something settling into place. Something that had been slightly off balance for a long time, finally finding the right footing. He refilled his coffee and went back to work. The Sorhai tried a different approach. Their envoy arrived 12 days later. Her name was Yenna, and she came in a single small diplomatic vessel, with no escort and no advance announcement. She was shorter than most Sorhai officials, with a calm and careful face, and she had a record within the conclave that anyone paying close attention would have found interesting. She had voted against the 60% trade reduction motion. She had spoken, in 2 previous sessions, in favor of revising humanity's classification under the Cultural and Developmental Index, though both motions had been tabled before they could be voted on. She had a reputation among the smaller delegations as someone who said what she thought when it cost her something to say it. She parked her ship at neutral distance and sent a message to Yonsei 7 that was notably different from the Velthari approach. It did not use the phrase mutual benefit. It did not discuss coordination or strategic interests. It said that she understood if no one wanted to speak with her today, that she did not expect to be welcomed, and that she intended to stay nearby for a while if that was permitted. It was short, and it read like something a person writes when they have thought carefully about what not to say. She got the standard reply. She stayed. On the 3rd day of her stay, she sent a personal message on a private frequency directed specifically to Juno by name. The message was short. It said that she was sorry for what had been done. Not on behalf of the Sarai Dominion, not as any kind of official statement. She was clear about that. She said it as herself, one person to another. She said she had always believed humanity deserved to be treated as equals, and that she had not fought hard enough for that when it might have made a difference. She said she was not asking for anything in return for saying it. She just wanted someone on Earth to know that not everyone on the other side of this saw things the way Dreth Vaz did. Then she waited. Junho read the message that evening in his coastal office. The window beside his desk looked out over the water, and the sea was gray and moving under a low sky. He read the message once, then again. He sat with it for a while. Then he opened a folder on his desk and saved it inside, in between two policy documents he had been reviewing. He also did not reply. On Yonsei 7, Minho kept running his daily shift logs and sending automated replies to whoever appeared at the boundary. There were others after the Velthari, a small Hesari observation vessel, an Orvesi diplomatic courier, one ship whose registration came back listed under a neutral trade body, but whose signal profile matched a Sorhai military communication pattern. All of them got the same message. All of them eventually left, except for Yenna, who stayed. She had been there for over 2 weeks when the footage started spreading across galactic networks. It had been filmed by journalists from the neutral Hesari worlds, 3 separate teams who had traveled to Earth and its colonies without press credentials or official access, simply as independent observers. They had walked through cities, they had filmed markets and transit stations and parks. They had filmed the morning rush on a colony world, a harvest coming in on another, a new water processing facility being completed on a third. They had filmed people eating and working and sitting outside in the evening. None of it was dramatic. That was the point of it. The journalists wrote short pieces to go with the footage. The clearest one came from a Hesari woman named Oris Veth, who wrote that she had traveled to Earth expecting to find some sign of the internal crisis that conclave-aligned media had been suggesting. She wrote that she had found nothing of the sort. She described Earth and its colonies as calm, functioning, and by all visible evidence, completely unbothered. She asked, at the end of her piece, what it meant that the civilization the conclave had spent 3 centuries describing as small and dependent was the only one in this situation that did not appear to be struggling. The piece was read on 14 worlds within a week. On Yonsei 7, Minho read it on his afternoon break and sent a copy to his mother. She replied that she had already seen it, and that she was proud of him. He smiled at that, though he was a little unsure what exactly she was proud of him for. He had mostly just been pressing a send button. But he accepted the pride anyway. Yenna's ship was still in neutral space. She had been there for 22 days when she sent a second message to Junho's private frequency. It was even shorter than the first. It said only, "Still here. No pressure. I just thought you should know." Junho read it in the evening, standing at his window. The sea outside had gone dark. The lights of a cargo vessel moved slowly across the horizon. He looked at the message for a while. He opened the folder. He looked at both messages sitting there, one below the other. He still did not reply. But he left the folder open on his desk when he went to bed. That was something, even if it was something small. The conclave session opened on a morning when the orbital station's climate system was running too warm, and nobody could agree on how to fix it. That small discomfort seemed to set the tone for everything that followed. Grand Speaker Oruvath stood at the head of the room and looked at the table below him. He had been Grand Speaker for 19 years, and in all of that time he had opened hundreds of sessions. He knew this room the way you know something you have stood inside so often that it no longer seems like a place, but simply like the shape of your days. He knew where the acoustics were good and where they went flat. He knew which delegates preferred to speak early in a session and which ones saved their energy for the afternoon. He knew the rhythms and habits of this place better than he knew most things in his life. What he did not know was how to run a session about humanity's absence without making the whole thing worse. He looked at the empty chair. It sat at the table exactly where it always had. Same position, same height, same plain design. It had not been removed. Nobody had suggested removing it. That felt like its own kind of statement, though Oruvath was not sure what the statement was. He looked away from it and called the session to order. The first item on the agenda was a formal review of what the official documents were calling the Human Withdrawal Event. The name had been chosen by a committee, which explained why it was so careful and so empty of meaning. It said what happened without saying anything real about it. Oruvath had not pushed back on the name, because fighting about names was not the battle he had energy for right now. The session collapsed within the first hour. It did not collapse dramatically. There was no single moment when everything broke. It collapsed the way old structures collapse, slowly, through accumulating pressure, each new crack making the next one easier. The Velthari hardliner faction, whose most prominent voice was a delegate named Rethkaz, opened with a proposal to demonstrate collective conclave resilience by replacing human-supplied goods and services through an emergency member-sharing arrangement. The proposal was detailed and confidently delivered. When Rethkaz finished, 3 delegations immediately raised objections, because the sharing arrangement required each of them to give substantially more than they would receive, and none of them had come to this session prepared to do that. Vas Kethera had been quietly reassigned to a domestic role, and the person in his seat was a younger official named Davin, who had clearly been instructed to avoid saying anything that could later be used against the Dominion. Davin said very little. He voted cautiously on procedural items and made no remarks on anything substantive. His silence was so consistent that by the second day, several delegations had stopped looking at him when they spoke. She said people were being affected by it right now, and she wanted to know who in the room was going to take responsibility for patrol coverage going forward. Nobody answered. The Velthari said the corridors were outside their jurisdiction. The Soraihai said they lacked the patrol capacity to take them on. 2 smaller delegations stared at the table and waited for someone else to speak. Oruvath called a recess before it became an open argument. The recess did not help. When the session resumed, Rethkaz returned to the floor with a new idea. He had spent the break thinking, which had not improved his judgment. He proposed that the Conclave send a formal convoy to Earth, a fleet of diplomatic vessels, he said, to reopen lines of communication in a way that demonstrated the Conclave's seriousness and commitment. He used the word escort once, seemed to realize how it sounded, and replaced it with presence mission in every sentence afterward. Most of the room understood what he meant, regardless of what he called it. The debate ran for 6 hours across 2 days. Several delegations were clearly uncomfortable with it. The Hasari representative said that arriving at Earth's boundary with an uninvited fleet was likely to be interpreted in exactly the way it would deserve to be interpreted, and that the likely result would be fewer options, not more. Rethkaz called this an overly cautious reading. The argument went in circles. No vote was called. The proposal stayed on the table. 3 days later, Admiral Tejo issued a routine fleet repositioning order. He did not hold a press event. He did not issue a statement to the Conclave or to any news organization. He did not request approval beyond what his standing operational authority already covered. He reviewed the order, signed it, and went back to his other work. 12 of Earth's deep space defense platforms moved. They were large. Each one carried the mass of a small artificial moon. Their full capability specifications had never been published in any document that was accessible to outside parties. What was known about them was that they existed, that they had been built and positioned over a period of 20 years as part of Earth's long-range strategic infrastructure, and that they had never been used in any offensive capacity. They had simply been there, far out in the dark between stars, doing nothing visible. Now they were doing nothing visible somewhere else. Their new positions placed them within clear passive sensor range of the Conclave's own orbital station. Not close, not in any space that could be formally disputed. Simply visible. On any sensor system the station was running. Large, steady, and not pointed at anything. Tejo had his lunch, reviewed 3 unrelated logistics reports, and attended a meeting about fuel supply schedules for the outer colony fleet. He did not mention the repositioning to anyone. The Conclave sensor operators noticed the platforms within 2 hours. By evening, everyone in the session knew. Nobody made an official statement about it. Nobody asked Earth for an explanation. Asking would have required them to formally acknowledge that the platforms were there, which would have required them to formally acknowledge why that made them feel the way it did, which nobody wanted to do. The hardliner convoy proposal was quietly removed from the active agenda the following morning. Rethkaz did not explain why. He simply did not raise it again. Hana read about the repositioning in a signal report and sat with it for a long time. She was not military. She had spent most of her adult life as an academic, a foreign policy researcher whose primary argument had always been that humanity should engage more with the rest of the galaxy, that isolation was not strength, that presence at the table mattered even when the table was unfair. She had been a vocal critic of what she called the galaxy's treatment of Earth. She had also been a vocal critic of Earth's habit of accepting that treatment. When the severance was announced, people who knew her work expected her to oppose it publicly. She had not. She had said it was the right call, made too late, and that the work of deciding what came after it was the important part. Now she was doing that work. She and Suji had been sharing a large conference room for 2 weeks. The walls were covered in printed notes, diagrams, and sections of the document they were building together. Suji handled the data, the trade projections, the infrastructure modeling, the supply chain timelines. Hana handled the framework, what the terms needed to say, how they needed to be structured, what they had to protect against. The document they were writing was long and specific in a way that years of bad agreements had made necessary. It covered trade rights, military cooperation, technology licensing, debt and credit structures, and a formal record correction clause that required the official Conclave archive to accurately document humanity's historical contributions. Hana had written that clause 4 times before she was satisfied with it. In her notes that night, she wrote about the platforms. She wrote that 12 solid structures, visible from the Conclave's own windows and aimed at nothing, communicated something that no speech had ever managed to communicate cleanly. They were not a threat. Earth was not going to start a war. But they were a fact. A fact that said, this is what patience looks like. This is what 300 years of restraint looks like when the restraint stops. She closed her notes and went back to the document. Outside, the platforms sat in the dark, quiet, present, immovable. Yenna had been sitting in her ship for 34 days when the message arrived. She had developed a routine by then. She woke early, made herself something warm to drink, and sat by the forward viewport to watch the stars for a while before starting her work. She spent her days reviewing policy files, writing internal reports that she was not entirely sure anyone would read, and sending one short daily message to her assistant back home confirming that nothing had changed. In the evenings, she read or tried to. She was not sleeping as well as she usually did, but that was something she had decided not to think about too carefully. She had told herself many times that she was going to leave. The arguments for it were reasonable. She had been here over a month. She had sent 2 messages to Junho and received no reply to either of them. She had no official authorization to be here. She had come on her own initiative, using allocated diplomatic travel time in a way that her department head had approved with visible uncertainty. There was no rational basis for expecting anything to come of it. She stayed anyway. She could not entirely explain why, except that leaving felt wrong in a way that staying did not, even when staying was uncomfortable. The message came through on the private frequency in the early morning, while she was still on her first drink of the day. She looked at the screen. The sender identification was not flagged with any official diplomatic code. It was just a name, Junho. She set down her drink and read it. 3 lines. The first was a time, given in standard galactic notation. The second was a set of coordinates. She recognized the region, a quiet stretch of space well outside any major jurisdiction, not far from an old way station she had read about once in a historical infrastructure survey. The third line was a single sentence. Bring those who are ready to listen. She read all 3 lines twice. Then she read them again. Then she started making calls. The station was called Doha Point. It had been built by a civilization that no longer existed, passed through several caretakers over the centuries, and eventually ended up in the administration of a small independent body that asked nothing of its visitors except basic courtesy and reasonable care of the facilities. It had not been used for any major meeting in living memory. Its central room was plain, a metal-walled space with a rectangular table, chairs that did not all match because they had been replaced in pieces over many decades, and overhead lights that were steady and slightly too bright. There were no decorations. There was no view. It was the kind of place that had no personality of its own, and therefore did not distract from the people inside it. 11 delegations arrived over 2 days. They came in various sizes and with varying levels of ceremony. Some brought full diplomatic transports with formal escort ships. Others came quietly in small vessels with minimal staff. Everyone who arrived understood the nature of what this meeting was. It was not a conclave session. It was not a summit. It had no formal status. It was simply a room that Junho had chosen, and the people in it were the ones who had decided, each for their own reasons, that they were ready to sit down. The Velfari hardliners were not there. Reth Kas had not been sent. She walked through Doha Point's corridors slowly, taking in the old walls and the worn floor panels and the faint hum of a life support system that sounded like it had been running continuously for a very long time. She found the main meeting room, looked at the table and the mismatched chairs, and chose a seat near the far end. Then she sat and waited. The Earth delegation arrived without announcement. Junho walked in with Nara on his left and Hana on his right. No escort, no ceremonial staff, just the 3 of them, carrying their own materials. Junho wore the same dark blue diplomatic coat he had worn on the day he walked out of the conclave. It was pressed and clean. He set a document case on the table and looked around the room at the assembled delegations. He did not make a speech. He sat down, opened the case, and took out the document. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. Then he began. The document Hana and Suji had built was not short. Junho walked through it section by section, clearly and without rushing. The trade section came first. New terms for Earth's independent trade rights, with specific protections against unilateral reduction votes, and a formal process for any future classification reviews that required Earth's full participation and consent. Then the military cooperation section, which defined in precise language what humanity would and would not commit to, under what conditions, and with what guarantees in return. Then the technology section, which established a licensing structure that replaced the old arrangement of informal sharing that had cost Earth more than anyone had ever formally acknowledged. There were questions at various points. Some of them were substantive, and Hana or Suji's data answered them. Some were procedural, and Nara handled those. A few were the kind of questions that are really objections in a polite disguise, and Junho listened to all of those carefully before responding, without raising his voice, with the patience of someone who had spent 30 years learning exactly when to wait and when to speak. Nobody argued against the core terms. They could not, really. Everyone in the room had come here knowing what position they were in. The data from the dependency map had been public for weeks. The corridor reports were public. The supply chain delays were public. The empty human chairs at 3 levels of galactic governance were very visible. The facts of the situation were not in dispute. What this meeting was, at its real core, was the negotiation of what came after those facts. And everyone present had already decided that they wanted something to come after them. They reached the acknowledgement clause in the late afternoon. Hana had written it with care, and she presented it herself. It required the Conclave's official historical archive to be formally corrected, not rewritten, not editorialized, just corrected, to accurately reflect humanity's documented contributions over 3 centuries. The military engagements, the medical sharing, the infrastructure support, the famine relief, the peace mediation. All of it documented, sourced, and placed on the permanent record in a way that could not be quietly revised later. It was not an apology clause. It did not require anyone in the room to say they were sorry. It simply required that the truth be written down somewhere that mattered. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished presenting it. The delegate from the Orvesi Union was the first to speak. He said his government supported the clause. He said it was right, and that it should have been done a long time ago. He said this without decoration, and when he was done, he looked at Junho directly in a way that communicated more than the words did. The other delegations followed. Some spoke briefly. Some signed without additional comment. The process was calm and without theater. Yena was the last to sign. She held the stylus for a moment before she put it to the document. When she looked up, she found Junho looking back at her, across the table. She had not spoken during most of the session. She had asked one question in the morning, and otherwise she had listened. "I'm sorry," she said. Just that. No political framing around it. No attribution to any body or institution. Just her own voice saying a plain thing. Junho held her look for a moment. "I know," he said. "I read your messages." "You didn't reply." "No," he said. "But I kept them. Both of them." She nodded once. She signed. There was no ceremony after that. The session wrapped up with the practicalities. Timelines, communication channels, the process for publishing the new framework to the wider galactic community. Delegates gathered their materials and departed in small groups. The room emptied quietly, without the noise and confusion of the conclave hall. The overhead lights stayed steady and too bright until the last person had gone. 3 days after the meeting, Nara delivered a short statement to the galactic press networks. It was brief, as everything Nara wrote tended to be. It said that Earth had entered a new diplomatic framework with a group of selected partner states, that full terms would be published through official channels, and that humanity considered this the beginning of a relationship structured around genuine equality and mutual respect. The last sentence she had written herself, and she had not asked anyone to approve it before she included it. Earth's door is open to those who knock respectfully. It always was. The statement spread quickly. On Yonsei 7, Minho read it on his morning break, nodded to himself, and went back to his shift. In her office, Suji looked at the dependency map one more time, then saved it in a new folder with a label that said simply, "So we remember." And Junho stood at the window of his coastal office and watched the sea move in the early light, coming in, pulling back, steady and patient, and in no hurry at all. The terms were humanity's now.